Okay, so this is a video I've been meaning to get around to making for quite some time now, yet it's still not going to be that structured. I think it's one of those videos that probably doesn't need to be highly structured because I pretty much know what it is that I want to say. Although that does mean that it might be a little bit rambling in the middle, but I do know where the video's heading towards the end. So if you're interested in the subject or you just want to sit down and listen to some old twat talk for a period of time, then this is probably quite an interesting video for you. Otherwise, you might want to go and watch something a little bit more tightly structured there. It involves the whole business of nature nurture and specifically relates to something I was watching on an episode of Horizon a number of months ago, but it was an episode of Horizon that I watched in one of those periods where I wasn't making videos on YouTube, so I never got round. At the time it was something that I wanted to comment on and make a video on, but it was one of those periods where I financially couldn't afford to devote the time that is required really for taking part on YouTube. Hopefully the kind of thing that won't happen anymore, by the way, now. Hopefully I'm kind of here for good for the near future. But that came into one of those periods of time. So it was an episode of the programme Horizon, and for those people that aren't in the UK, Horizon is a science programme. It's a really, really good science programme. It is a popular science programme, so you can't expect too much from it. And over the past couple of decades, what's tended to happen is that a series of Horizon, different episodes of the same series have had different producers and they've been produced in different ways, such that often when you watch the different episodes, it doesn't even look as if it's part of the same series necessarily that you're watching. So it tends to be a little bit hit and miss, probably more now than it was in the sort of 80s when I remember watching it as a child growing up. And there are some quite interesting episodes from there. Actually, there's a couple that involve Richard Dawkins talking about evolution, old episodes of Horizon which are really rather fascinating that you can look out there. But this particular episode dealt with nature versus nurture and men and women's brains wired differently, and wired differently in a way that results in tangible differences between men and women. And are those differences the result of biological processes involved, the result of genetic processes, I suppose I should say, phenotypic expressions of things which are in some ways innate, or is it the result of cultural factors that accounts for any difference in wiring between male and female brains where those differences occur? So that's what it was about. But there was some specific stuff regarding nature versus nurture involving children that featured part of the programme, and that was the bit that I really wanted to discuss. But before I want to do that, there's an extra bit that I want to tack on to what the programme discussed at the end, which is the ultimate goal of the video in many ways. But there's a bit that I maybe ought to tack on at the front, which is to say that often when discussions occur involving nature versus nurture, it's framed in this kind of simplistic way in terms of how much of what makes us the person we are is nature and how much of it is nurture. And I think that's one of those questions that is necessarily intractable. There are factors that are unknown that we understand, and people kind of frame it that if we knew those things, then we would be able to say that 50% of what makes us is nature and 50% is nurture, or it's 90% nature, or it's 90% nurture, or what have you, right? 90%. By nurture, I mean the full gamut of cultural factors, both your parents, your peers, your upbringing, society, the Western culture if you live in the West, all those different things, of course, is what we mean by that. Not just the simple nurture of the parent-child relationship. But I propose that it's not a question that you can quantify in that way. An example that I gave before when I made a video along these lines was along the idea of eating, how we eat, whether that's nature or nurture. And the simplistic example given that, given often sneeringly as well, because most of these examples that are given because most people's position seems to be tied in to some kind of ideology, right? And it seems to be very cut and dried, and then their appreciation of things such as evolutionary psychology almost results from their ideology rather than their ideology being informed from factors such as sociology and evolutionary psychology. At least that's how it comes across to me. So on both sides there seems to be a lot of sneering analysis and misrepresentation of the other side's opinion. One of the things that I often point the finger at is people who take what is arguments from the evolutionary psychology side for statistical differences amongst groups, suggesting in part a predisposition towards something and portraying it as biological determinism rather than predisposition, and in individuals rather than something that is displayed as an average within groups. Or the other falsity, I know I'm disappearing from what I was going to say. The other thing is also suggesting that, well, because this culture does things differently, that demonstrates that there can't be a biological factor involved. Of course, it doesn't demonstrate anything of the sort, anything more than me driving into the garage and saying my car's been pulling to the left, and the garage owner saying, well, you must be mistaken because you just turned the car to the right to drive into the garage. Just because your car pulls to the left doesn't mean that you can't steer harder to the right and make a right-hand turn. And it's the same thing here. Just because one culture, it might be some indication that culture is much more important and significant than biology, but just because one culture books the system isn't to say that there is no biological component involved. There is no predisposed element acting on statistical and population levels involved in the mix there. But one of the examples that I'd given in the past was the idea of eating. Okay, remember we're talking about how much is nature and how much is nurture, and I'm saying it's an intractable thing to quantify. You know, it depends what level of explanation that you place above any other level. The example that I gave in the past was with eating, and somebody might say, well, obviously eating with a knife and fork is a Western thing. If you look around the world, some people eat with their hands, some people eat with chopsticks. So the example of how we eat is an example of something that is entirely cultural, it's entirely nurture. But that's because you've arrived at that outcome, because you've looked at it on that higher level of the behaviour. The fact is that all these cultures, the food is moved from the plate or the bowl or the board to the mouth with the hand, one way or another, either using implements or just using the hand. I don't know of any cultures where you mash your face like a dog would do into the food. So look at it on that perspective. The eating behaviour becomes a much more biologically driven process than it becomes a culturally driven process. So it seems to depend what level you look at it on. Now, one of the responses I got when I talked about that in the past was that people said, well, maybe it's just a physiological constraint. Human bodies are such that even if there was no predispositions whatsoever, you would learn. It's just an easier thing to move the face to the mouth, the food to the mouth, than it is the mouth to the food. And that may well be true. As we know that as babies develop, they learn to walk by mimicking our behaviour, but they can't mimic our behaviour when they learn to crawl. And it doesn't seem that babies are especially innately gifted, as if they've some kind of talent, some natural talent at crawling. It seems as if they just kind of learn how to crawl, and many babies learn to crawl in a totally different way to many other babies. But just the sheer physiological constraints of a human baby means that babies generally learn to crawl before they learn to walk, and often learn to crawl in different ways to one another. So it could be that eating is of that type. So I accept that maybe that wasn't the best example. But if you compare other things, such as that other sneering example that people give, that pink for girls, blue for boys, and look at that as something which is obviously cultural. And then look at something which is sort of perhaps the fact that some people seem just to be predisposed towards a depression, or maybe just seem to get angry a lot more easily than perhaps their sibling, and the suggestion that perhaps there's a genetic component towards that. And I think most people think there maybe is a genetic component that predisposes some people towards depression, that makes some people more angry in terms of their character, more aggressive than other people, that could be one of the components. How do you quantify weighing those two things? If somebody asks you, how much of what makes us us is nature and how much is nurture? Well, that's a purely arbitrary subjective judgment that you make. So I would suggest to you that anybody that says it's 60% this, 40% that, that number is entirely arbitrary based upon how they're choosing to weight these factors in the first place. So then moving on to this program then. This Horizon program, I found this really interesting because what they were looking at in this part of the program was children. And the fact that most parents will report. This is the starting. Let me tell you the structure of the program. It was done in terms of sort of almost like a sort of like you would have in a courtroom with a sort of confrontational thing. There was the two presenters at the start of the program, and then it bounced back from presenter to presenter. And one was presenting a sort of case for nature and one for nurture, and it went back and back, and then that came together at the end and made the kind of conclusions that you would expect, which is it's going to involve some of both. We don't really know to what degree or exactly in what ways. So it's the kind of things that you would expect really at the end of the program. But what happened with regard to these children is first they made the case that you ask pretty much any parent and they will tell you that boys and girls do seem to gravitate towards different toys, and that seems to be taken as read. Okay, and this is partly what stemmed me making this program now, is reading a few things, people complaining about the gendered nature in which toys are sold, in which toys are bought, in which we give toys to boys and girls, blah, 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 okay, and complaining about that. And I do to some extent understand those complaints, as you'll understand as the video goes on. But it talked about parents and parents' experiences about boys and girls gravitating towards different things. So you think, well, fair enough. So then they showed you this experiment, and they showed you the footage of these people in these rooms with young children. And these young children were kind of at the age where they were old enough to just about sit up, right? They're old enough to sit up and start playing with toys and use their hands a little bit more, and to start showing an interest in manipulating more complicated toys. And perhaps at the age where prior to that they would have tended to have more gender-neutral toys, rattles and that kind of shite, you know, more gender-neutral toys. And they were given a selection of toys on a table. And then somebody was brought in and said, that, right, this is Susan, okay, I want you to play with Susan for a quarter of an hour and see what toys Susan wants to play with. And so this happened, obviously, and it showed you some of the footage of some of the kids playing. And then afterwards, they asked the parents, you saw some of the footage, and then they weren't parents, some of these non-parents, they didn't know the child, that's important. They asked some of these adults, what toys did Susan like playing with? And they'd say, well, Susan seemed to gravitate towards the dolls. And Joe, he seemed to gravitate towards playing with tucks and all that kind of thing. So that kind of chimed in with what we would be talking about with those parental expectations. But the thing with this experiment is that things weren't quite what they seemed. What they'd done is Susan wasn't Susan, Susan was John. Right, Susan was a little boy that they put in girls' clothes and said was called Susan. So the expectation of the person there was that this was a little girl. And what tended to happen is, based on those expectations, they then chose toys that they thought were appropriate for a little girl, or if they thought it was a little boy, they chose toys that were appropriate for a little boy. And that's the toys that the child played with more often than the other toys. But what was even more interesting is when you could see what was happening on the video, and of course you were in, as the viewer, you were in on this experiment. But when they then asked the surrogate parents who hadn't previously known these children to report what toys the child was playing with, they reported, well, Susan was playing mainly with dolls, even though, of course, as we know, Susan was John. But they didn't report, or they didn't realise that they had imposed their choices. They reported that, no, Susan had picked those toys of her own volition. Joe had picked the trucks of his own volition, whereas in actual fact what had happened is that they'd steered the child towards those choices based on their presuppositions of what boys and girls would play with. So that gives you some understanding, and perhaps for most people that veers you towards the nurture side of it. But then they told you about another experiment with these Barbary macaques, these monkeys. And what they did to try and take the adult out of the equation altogether, they got these baby monkeys in this enclosure, and apparently this has been done a number of times. And they threw a lot of human toys in there that these baby monkeys wouldn't have any experience of. But some of them were clearly anthropomorphic. They were dolls, all right. Now, though they were human dolls, it was from a monkey's perspective, it clearly looks like the equivalent of a monkey, right? Because we don't look that far different from a fucking monkey. We're all primates. And then other ones were trucks and stuff with moving parts. Okay, so there was no adult monkeys. The adult monkeys weren't getting involved and saying, "You're a boy, you want to be playing with that." Because there's none of those presuppositions anyway amongst the monkeys, and the adult monkeys weren't really getting involved. All the little baby monkeys ran off and then gradually came and started exploring these toys. But what was happening is the little girl monkeys were overwhelmingly playing with the dolls, and the little boy monkeys were playing with the toys that had moving parts. So even when an adult wasn't involved, different monkeys, male and female monkeys, were gravitating towards different toy choices. I don't know why I'm finding that so hard to say, which kind of suggests that there is a nature element involved in those decisions that the child is making. So it suggests that there's two factors that might be involved in all of this. So I knew there was a bit of an aside involved there, and I'd forgotten what the fucking aside was, so I just paused it because I didn't want to forget the aside, because I think it's one that's really interesting. And what I want to do, the aside on this, is just to think about some of the complaints that's made with regard to evolutionary psychology. In fact, I touched on this in a video that I made to Mathavan Bossusto, or whatever he calls himself, the other day. And this is that often the same standards, the same criticisms that are made to evolutionary psychology aren't made to other fields involved in evolutionary biology, even though it appears that the same material issues are involved. So this is a good chance to describe what I mean by that. We're looking then at these girl monkeys playing with these dolls. Okay, but think about the other things that mammals do. Let's think of predatory mammals, juveniles, and their play with one another, and the way that the rough and tumble play, which we say prepares them for perhaps the fighting, perhaps in the case of males, the fighting, the courtship fights and the fights over females, and the mock pouncing and predating behaviour. And we say this is them practising the skills that they will be used in hunting. And we say that these behaviours have evolved. Right, they've evolved a predisposition to these modes of play because that makes them more successful adults. They will be more evolutionary fit as adults because they've practiced these behaviours as children. And most of us accept that. We don't sneer at those explanations, we accept them. But bear in mind, those explanations are unevidenced and cannot be evidenced, right? The fact that those animals display those behaviours can be evidenced. The fact that those behaviours may have an evolutionary and obviously a biological basis can be evidenced. But the actual result cause, that the evolutionary pressure that causes that behaviour is the same behaviour as an adult, is just something that we can surmise because of all the alternatives that we can think of. That is the one that seems overwhelmingly most likely. Now, that isn't the same as evidencing it. And it's the same jump to conclusion as evolutionary psychologists make when they take a behaviour and then say, well, if this is as a result of evolution and biology, which can be evidenced, these are the reasons why we think that might have evolved. And the reason I bring that up now is because I think we can make the same kind of argument perhaps with these young monkeys playing with dolls, which is that there is conferred some benefit in the mature female monkey in having practiced her own child rearing skills, how you would nurture, how you would feed, how you would interact with a small monkey. Right, if she practices that will confer an advantage to her evolutionary fitness. It probably wouldn't confer the same advantage to a young male monkey. He might be better served expending his time somewhere else. Now, I'm making that on the basis of observing that behaviour, observing that similar versions of that behaviour. I can't think of the word I'm looking for there, but similar versions of that behaviour exist in the adult. Okay, and saying, well, one is occurring because it will be beneficial in the adult. But to say that that is evolved for that reason, some would say, well, that's overstepping the mark. What I would say is, if you're saying that's overstepping the mark, it's maybe overstepping the mark throughout evolutionary biology. When we talk about a cheetah and a gazelle having an evolutionary arms race, and the cheetah has got faster to escape to catch the gazelle, and the gazelle has got faster to escape the cheetah, we know that they've both evolved to get faster and faster over the years. We know that it does help cheetahs catch gazelles and gazelles to escape cheetahs, but to say that that is the reason why, that is the selection pressure that has operated over the past several tens of thousands of years. Probably not a lot more than that, because I think cheetah evolution is quite recent, I think, or there certainly was a bottleneck quite recently. So to say that is the same kind of speculative shit that people criticise evolutionary psychology for, but seemingly we accept it. As long as it doesn't involve human cognitive processes, we're quite happy with that speculation. That's just a little aside that I want to make there. But I think we can see why it would be beneficial in children, perhaps, to have that difference. But this is the point that I wanted to make, right, that we're getting to now when I first watched this programme, which is this: that how we tend to view it is, I've given you two factors there now. There was the seemingly chime against one another. There was the behaviour of the adults in seemingly steering the children, not even being aware of it, subconsciously steering the children towards toy choices. Why can't I say that? And then there was the behaviour of the children steering themselves towards toy choices in these Barbary macaques, and saying, well, maybe the same thing happens with humans. We can't do the same experiment with humans because it would be regarded as unethical, of course, to shield them away from human interactivity so we could conduct this experiment. So that's the best we're going to get, is the macaques. So we can say these two things, but we tend to then look at the parental contribution and say, well, that is nurture. What I want to say is, can we actually say that it is entirely nurture, that it is culture that has cultured these parents into saying, these are toy norms for boys, these are toy norms for girls, and then the parent from that perspective pushes the child? I am sure that that happens to a degree. But think on this as well. If we accept that it is beneficial, if we accept for a moment, and if this is something you don't accept, well, just accept it for the sake of this argument, see where the argument goes, and then you can carry on rejecting all the things that you rejected to begin with. But if we accept that it is beneficial in terms of evolutionary fitness over the past 100,000 years, let us say, in fact going further back to a common ancestry with the other great apes and then with the old world monkeys, blah, 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 blah. If it is evolutionarily beneficial for the juvenile males to play with one type of toys and the juvenile females to play with another type of toys, and have slightly different modes of play at some point in their development, okay, if there is some beneficial factor to that, and if that has some biological basis, and if that is something that could be selected for by evolution, then encouraging those same things within a parent would be beneficial and could be selected for by evolution. So the corollary of all this is that perhaps those parents pushed those children into different toy choices, not just because society has cultured them to do so, but because there is some innate predisposition that as a parent, for you to successfully pass on your genes and be successful in the genetic race throughout the generations, to be successful in that, perhaps the same kind of genes that may predispose those young female macaques versus the Barbary macaques versus the young male Barbary macaques could influence parent choices as well, so that the most successful parent would tend to give dolls more often to a little girl and give other kinds of toys such as a sword to a young boy, because that means that you develop in the types of society that have existed throughout the millennia more successful adult males as they develop, and more successful adult females. Successful not being in terms of how much money they can earn or how much prestige, but in terms of how many offspring they have and how successful they are at bringing those offspring to adulthood. So I think that's a really important thing to consider when we consider this whole question of nature nurture, that perhaps nature can influence parental behaviour as well as influencing juvenile behaviour. And that was really what I wanted to get at in terms of this video. What I want to add on, bolt on at the end, because I know that it's so easy to get misunderstood talking about things like that, is that this is a descriptive argument that I am making here. I'm not trying to make some kind of normative argument and say, so because this is the differences, we ought to try and maintain these differences. In fact, not at all. You know, I know as somebody, I have a little baby that is now £6 and 14 ounces as of yesterday, and it hasn't been born yet, and I don't know whether it's going to be a boy, and I don't know whether it's going to be a girl. But what I want to be as a parent, I want to interact and spend time and do all the things that mothers traditionally do with their parents, other than breastfeeding it, right? That isn't going to work. But other than that, I want to do all those things, probably more than any male has done in my lineage, going back perhaps millions of years, right? I don't know how far back you'd have to go. There might be some stage in evolution where the male played a bit more of a role. Perhaps going back, you know, until sexual reproduction began, I want to spend more time than any of my ancestors have done as the male. But I'm slightly stuck in the problem that whereas my wife, when she grew up, would have been encouraged to play with dolls and perhaps innately would have been drawn to play with dolls, we want men to take on this much more active role in fatherhood, and fathers want an equal status as parents, which certainly in the UK they don't have. If fathers want that status and we want fathers to take on that role, then perhaps we have to let go of nature a little bit and say, do you know what? And this is something that I plan to do if I have a little boy, is to make sure that he does spend some time, maybe not as much time as a little girl would want to spend playing with dolls, but that he will feel comfortable playing with dolls, and that as he grows up, he won't feel like he can't get involved with children as much and with babies as much, because he's a boy, because that's how I was cultured and that's how I was brought up. And I know that that's given me a reticence with small children that I find hard to overcome. If me and my wife go and see somebody who just had a baby, she'll freely and easily pick the baby up, and people's understanding will be that she will freely and easily pick the baby up, whereas it's more of a stretch for me. It's something that I almost have to force myself to do. And it's something that I feel uncomfy doing, and it's perhaps something that people don't expect of me. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we got past that? If we just stick to where nature takes us, whether it's via the predisposition of the parent or the predisposition of the child, we will never get beyond that. So that's kind of where I want to leave that discussion as. I'm interested to know what your thoughts are, but I've talked for so fucking long, especially not being able to say toy choices at any point. Yes, any point during this video that you're probably pissed off with listening to me and you want to go and listen to something a little bit well structured. Well, thank you for watching if you've got this far, and bye for now.